Okay, so today we're going to talk about orature or storytelling and how that kind of fits into our timelines here. It kind of overlaps around the edges, um, in in as far as like the end of kind of the revolutionary era, wrapped around like the romanticism. So some of the names will be similar and familiar as we kind of talk about them. But it was its own thing and had its own reasons to it. So we kind of talk about it, pull it out, and talk about it separately. So we're looking at it through a folk tale and folklore lens, is what the intention is of this. So let me get this kind of going here. Whoops. Backwards, backwards, backwards. So a few things kind of looking at the background here so we kind of know where we're at. So kind of looking at some timelines, right? Looking at in the 1850s, if we're kind of going backwards here, looking at the 1850s, thinking about the world literacy rate in the 1850s was 10%. So that's really low, obviously, though better than it was. But 10% is really low. So you can imagine that, going through up until that period and then beyond, that how were people, moving their stories forward, which, we talk about when you're in like an English 102 class, is stories are not written down up until that period for the most part. Stories are told, especially within cultures, stories are told from person to person, right? Stories are handed down. Stories are told around the hearth, around the fire, in the home. It's part of entertainment. It's part of a intercultural piece, right? So those stories are told orally, right? Hence the whole orature piece here. So they weren't written down. But by the 1920s, so in this time jump right here, which is a 70-year piece, the literacy rate changes to 28%. So obviously for us now in modern day, 28% is still very low, but considering the jump from 10%, that's a huge jump actually. So that's really moving. So this whole change started showing a bigger interest and more people wanting to read, obviously. So part of this goes in with this, according to a Ugandan linguist named Pau Zimru, conveyed that there was an artistic value of oral expression, which is the storytelling, right? An artistic value in oral expression, which there still is today, right? There's definitely a knack to storytelling, right? You've probably heard stories told to you by somebody who is a really good storyteller versus when somebody tells you a story who's not very good at it at all, where it comes out, it's boring, it's backwards, it lays flat, and you're just like, okay, versus somebody who has a really a good skill for it. It's you become engrossed in it, even if it's not even that interesting of a story, they can make it an interesting story. So it definitely has its own value to it versus it being on the page. But there's a relationship between oral literature and written word, and it took on a whole different importance in the 19th century, so in the mid to late 1800s. And there were multiple reasons for that. So, and some of it had to do with the changing literacy rate, right? More people could read, more people wanted to read, so they needed more things to read. So this changing over had something to do with it. In a traditional agrarian societies such as Russia, only 5% of the population could actually read. So they were still passing stories down orally. But an interest in oral traditions rose sharply in the 19th century as many nations made the widespread shift to literacy. So think about what happens So first and foremost, think about this whole idea. I'm trying to find my mouse. Woo, lost my mouse. Think about what happens when you have an agrarian society versus an urban society. So that's one of the pieces here, okay? So first of all, you have a literacy rate change. So people are moving from an oral tradition to a reading tradition. They went from not being able to read, so they had to preserve their stories orally, and now they can read and write more of them. Still not a lot. You also had this whole agrarian versus urban society, which is part of the same thing, part of the idea of not being able to read, of having the same problem. So the population shifted, right? The people changed jobs and changed places where they were working. It became, instead of out in the farmlands and widespread from each other and isolated on individual farms and pieces of land where you're miles and miles away from your nearest neighbor. So it made people isolated to tell their own stories and pass their stories along, and least likely and less likely to learn to read and write, and didn't have as much of a use for it, to moving into the cities. Remember, we talked about this with industrialization and revolution, that there was a huge push for this urbanization of population. So everybody moving into the cities, loss of the agrarian society had moved and changed. So when people become more in an urban society, people become more likely to learn to read, or need to learn to read, and less likely to have the same type of relationships within their circles and cultures and than they had before. And they're pressed upon small areas, crammed together in different cities, and it changes the whole way that people lived. So when that happened, an interest in the oral traditions became very important. And that happened at the same time as this widespread shift to literacy happened. So when this all sort of happened, we had writers like the Grimm brothers, which we'll talk about separately in just a second, who were looking at fairy tale preservation. They tried to preserve spoken stories before they vanished, because that was what was happening, partly because of this, partly because of the urbanization of society, right? That whole, very specific cultures out on their own in specific agrarian areas, passing their stories down around the fire, around the hearth, had changed. And they're all crammed together, sometimes with multiple different cultures in smaller areas, and not able to have the same lifestyle, but also being pushed to become literate, where you didn't need to pass down those stories in the same way anymore. So sometimes they were becoming lost, right? Also, and this became a bigger thing, right? So, and maybe part of, wrapped up in the same thing, was the idea of colonization, okay? The Europeans were also involved in imperialism, and during their conquest became fascinated by folk tales abroad and that resembled their native stories. So this kind of is a double-edged sword right here. So specifically, first on one side of this sword, we'll talk about for a second Willem Bleek. He was a British scholar who took advantage of the imprisonment of a number of nomadic Kung people in southern Africa, and he argued that oral stories from Africa needed to be transcribed as a way for Europeans to understand their own past. Now, the positives of that was that he did do that. He transcribed a huge number of traditional stories from these specific South African groups and people. And so those specific stories were saved. And he did feel that it helped people understand where they came from, their pasts. and understand different cultures, which is why folklore is saved in the first place. That is its purpose of um, of of saving it altogether for any culture. However, the fact that they were taken advantage of, and the reason that they were being saved in the first place was because they were being essentially wiped out, because they were being imprisoned and taken over, because they were being colonized. So they wouldn't have had to have been preserved if they wouldn't have been being colonized by the Brits in the first place. So this idea of colonization, control or conservation, that they took advantage of people for this control in the first place. So colonization in general. So I kind of have this Viva la Revolution thing up here. So remember when we talked about Napoleon and also the Europeans, right? We had that conversation before about that time, that place and time where they made the saying, the sun never sets on the British Empire, because they had so many colonies in so many countries around the world that was essentially true. Because every place they planted their flag, they considered part of Britain, Great Britain, right? So what happened when they did that was that they took over the areas, right? Including of course, our own country, including America, until it became its own country. So when they did that, the people who lived there often fell under that rule and often found that they may have lost their own culture. And same with when Napoleon pushed across the land. And later on, when we talk about World War I and World War II, we'll see the same fear, right? That when cultures see another culture encroaching upon theirs, their fear is of losing their own culture, right? Whether they take on pieces of the culture that's coming or not is a totally different thing. But there always is this fear of completely losing your own. So there became a widespread rush to write down and preserve folklore for the purpose of preserving cultures, because they're like, how else do you do that? And they became convinced that this was the best way to, in fact, preserve cultures that they could think of, which was to write down the folklore and fairy tales of the cultures that were there. So a lot of different scholars in different areas set about to do exactly that. And that's why it became so important, because as these mass groups, these countries with these bigger presence that were able to push across so many other countries did so, it really, freaked out a lot of people, and rightly so. So let me go to our next one. So we're going to just look at a few of the bigger ones. There are thousands, and we could stretch across far and wide to every country and look at so many, but we don't have that kind of time in this semester to do so. The book set goes into a lot more than what we're going to look at right now, but I just picked some of the really big ones to just kind of get us through some of the pieces. So probably the biggest names out there for folktale still, despite the fact that they wrote in the 1800s, would be the Grimm brothers. So the Grimm brothers were German. So they collected fairy tales that we would still be familiar with today, and that would be like Little Red Riding Hood, Rapunzel, Hansel and Gretel, Snow White, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, right? And of course, several of these have been adapted many times over the years in many different countries, in many different languages. Different countries have their own versions of those stories that they may call them different things. So they weren't just unique to Germany, but they had it was like different countries have their own version of similar tales. So that is interesting how when countries are very close set together, that they may have the same stories or very similar stories, but have their own kind of version of a similar story. And of course, we have also adapted that because America is a big kind of mixing pot of many different cultures. And so we have our own kind of versions of it now. And then Disney has readapted them again. So the Grimm brothers heavily set forward to do this. Their originals included, if you ever go back and read the original Grimm brothers versions, which don't look anything like probably any of the cartoon versions you have seen. The originals include a lot of scenes of sexual and physical violence. They were used as entertainment for whole villages, and they were not solely for children's fairy tales, but they were also meant as lessons for cautionary tales, a lot of them. And you think about the time period, right? Because it was very dangerous. So cautionary tales, they were for entertainment and sometimes for adult entertainment, not just for children. And also moral tales and for behavioral tales. How do you act? How do you treat others? How do you treat your elders? How do you act as a person in this society? So they had a lot of purposes in their actions and in their tales, which is the same for all fairy tales and folk tales. It just depends on how they're written as to which thing that they lean towards more. The Grimms were editors. They were not authors, so it's not like they made up these stories. They are not fiction made by the Grimm brothers. They did not write the stories. They gathered the stories. So these were old stories told and handed down traditionally through orally from person to person, generation to generation to generation. They gathered them. They did edit them, so they have been altered, and that happens over time. So if these tales were told 300 years before then, they probably sounded a little bit different. 100 years after that, probably sounded a little bit different. Each time they're told in a different time period, they probably take on elements of that time period to make them feel relevant and also probably reflect that time period and what is important in that time period or the people of that time period. So in the early 1800s, when the Grimm brothers collected these stories and adjusted them in their editing for their readers of that time period, same thing. So they sought to preserve traditional German lore, just as Napoleon's French armies invaded and imposed new laws and customs. So this was their purpose. They wanted to preserve what they saw as traditional German folklore. Most of Grimm's sources were educated women who had absorbed traditional stories from servants and nursemaids, and they added some new material that explored psychological motives of the characters. So they combined some traditional folk elements with some middle class appeal, hence a little bit of changes for the 1800s that they wrote them in. For this class, we read The Three Spinners, so addressed poor peasant life and physical work, showing the difference between social classes and what a happy ending meant for those forced to do hard labor, right? So that was for Germany. So looking at Joseph Jacobs, early 20th century, so we're talking like the beginning of the 1900s, early 1900s, and that was Tom Tit Tot. So he was doing the same sort of thing that the Grimm brothers were doing, only he was doing it for England. It was a very different sounding story, the Tom Tit Tot story, but maybe vaguely familiar. He collected folklore for the sake of preserving traditional English culture, right? Traditional English culture. In spite of the fact that he was an Australian-born Jewish man who settled in the United States, he wanted to preserve traditional English culture. He despised the influence of the Grimm brothers in England because at this point, the Grimm brothers stories, because they were written like 50 years before or 60 years before this, the Grimm Brothers stories were so popular and are still popular. You can go to any bookstore and buy a book of the Grimm Brothers stories. I have a book of the Grimm Brothers stories. They're included in pretty much any big lit stories. They maintained their place in lit and popularity as far as fairy tales and like the big definitive folklore status to go to. So that really bothered him. This really bothered Joseph Jacobs. He felt that their influence was, he didn't like them having influence, their German influence in England. He tried to gather authentic English stories to establish a sense of national heritage in English children. So you see this kind of tug of war of, I don't want your German stories affecting the English children, right? That kind of thing. So he saw folktales as a key to national unity, which is what they all did. He gathered the sources and rewrote them, removing dialect speech but adding some local color for effect. Because often if they included dialect speech, it became extremely difficult for other people to read. So he smoothed that out. He viewed Tom Tit Tot as a humorous story that teaches superstition and the power the person can hold over another whose name he discovers, which is very reminiscent of Rumpelstiltskin, right? Later, that was this is actually a picture from Rumpelstiltskin, but it's very reminiscent of that story. Okay, so that's England. So we did Germany, England. Let's talk about Ireland. So Ireland, I read A Donegal Fairy and A Brewery of Eggshells. Irish stories are a whole different kettle of fish, right? So they have their own peculiar storylines. The storylines are very different. So we have William Butler Yeats. Somebody may have used William Butler Yeats for their poetry because he was a well-known poet, more so than collector of fairy tales. I do have a big, huge volume of Yeats Irish folk tales on my shelf also. But he published Fairy and Folk Tales of Ireland in 1889. So he was after the rest of them, or kind of in the middle, I guess. So after the Grimm, but before Joseph. So William Butler Yeats collected and published this book in 1889 after becoming frustrated by the schooling of Irish children by the British government, who saw fairy tales and local superstitions as primitive and backwards. So thinking about, right, that Britain had taken over part of Ireland and how that worked, and there was a lot of, and still is always, a lot of tug of war there and problems, and that Britain and the English were the ones teaching the Irish children there, and they didn't like the way that they had all of their superstition and told their folk tales and their fairy stories, and that really bothered him. So he's like, well, I'm going to pull together our folk tales, our fairy stories. So this story appears without a narrator to frame it as though it's being told directly by old Matt Craig, depending on which story you're talking about. This image is it's a picture of William Butler Yeats in 1920. So notice they're all doing the same thing. We want our people, our children, to be taught traditional stories of our people, right? Passing down the culture. Same thing. We want to keep our culture and our children to learn our culture. That's what it really is about. Okay, so this is the last one, and these are like some of the best. So the Anansi stories. So I know this is kind of crowded up here with a lot of wording because I kind of put it up here. So the Anansi stories, originally, I mean, they come from all over the place. They kind of put them up there depending on where you read them from. They just say South Africa. but it depends. It could be from Ghana, Jamaica. United States has Anansi stories, but they were adapted much, much, much later. So told in the oral tradition, often in a circle with an audience, because it's meant to be a great story being told. Sometimes acted out stories reinforce a shared sense of moral norms and appropriate behaviors, which is that's often how all folklore is, right? Or originally was. Anansi is the underdog often, or the trickster in the stories. And these stories came to America and other places because of the slave trade, which is why eventually we see the Anansi stories come to America. There was a point, and it depends on how old you are watching this, if that Disney did have an Anansi story, which they have long since removed because of the absolutely terrible way that it was put out there. And they instead of Anansi, they called it Aunt Nancy. And there's books too. There's a lot of American children's books, like those little golden books that had those golden spines on them. Because I remember these even when I was little, which was Briar Rabbit and Briar Bear, right? And Tar Baby. So those are Anansi stories, right? So the spider Anansi often outsmarts other animals and sometimes even the gods, depending on if he gets to be the trickster in the story or if he gets to be the underdog in the story. He gets to compensate for physical weaknesses by using his cunning, which is why he's often the trickster. He will play, yeah, I said that already. For the Ashanti people of West Africa, Anansi is almost always the underdog, so it kind of depends on what area the Anansi story comes from. Village elders tell the Anansi stories after dark with the audience circling around them, which I think I said already. Let me see what else I wanted to say. Enforced illiteracy meant that the slaves were restricted from education, but thereby they kept their traditions alive by passing down these stories. This image here is a Briar Rabbit from Uncle Remus. So when you're reading the stories that we had to read for class, you'll notice that the weird spelling, right? The BR apostrophe ER, which sometimes it looks a little different depending on which story you're reading it from. It's because there's an accent in there. So they're kind of representing the accent. Sometimes it depends on where it came from, the islands or whatnot. So later when it came to America, they didn't know what to do with that, I guess. And they just called it briar, like a briar patch. And they're like, oh, it's Briar Rabbit and Briar Bear, right? Like a briar patch. But it wasn't meant to be that originally. It's that BR apostrophe ER was meant to be like the showing like a traditional wording, just like trying to keep it in its own wording to say brother, right? Brar Rabbit, Brar Bear, like that. It was supposed to be Brother Rabbit, Brother Bear. That's like when I was saying before about how, let me go backwards. Who was I talking about? Not Yates. That Joseph Jacobs from England, when he was doing his books on the English stories, when he collected them, he actually smoothed out the dialect because he felt it was too difficult for people to read the dialect outside of the areas. So if you've ever read any stories, in fact for this class, because you have to read Dracula, you will get to a part in Dracula where she, I want to say it's Mina, talking to a sailor or somebody from the docks. He's up on a hill where she's sitting, and she talks to this guy up on the hill. I think he's a sailor. And you can't hardly understand a single word that he says to her because he's speaking to her in what would be there. He's speaking to her in English, but the words are written in the dialect of how he says it, like his accent, right? The author wrote it with the person's accent intact. So you're like, what in the heck did that guy just say? Don't feel bad if you have no idea, because I have no idea either. It's terrible. It's very difficult to read. Well, half of the stuff that was Joseph Jacobs wrote down, you wouldn't be able to read it either, because if you don't come from this area, you wouldn't be able to tell with their accents what they said either. Same with the Irish, same with the German. Well, the German would be in a totally different language. But with the Anunzi, they left in the stories you guys have, they left some of it in there, like the Briar, right? That was supposed to be brother, right? They just took some of it, hey mom, Briar Bear, like that. It was brother. But when it came to America, they just didn't know what it was. So it became Briar. And same with Anunzi. They didn't know what the word was, so they changed it to Aunt Nancy. So we now have Briar Rabbit and Aunt Nancy, which sounds not even close to as cool as Anunzi. So sometimes the rabbit is in there as the trickster. The rabbit is a trickster for many different culture stories, and kind of like the fox. But it's usually a spider. So they're pretty cool stories. All right, so that's kind of it for the whole thing with the folklore lens. Again, every culture, anywhere, cultures, subcultures, throughout time will maintain them and move them from an oral tradition into a written tradition in order to capture them, to keep them, to move them forward and have a record of them as they go on and be able to show them to a new generation. That was the whole purpose.